Welcome back in time again with BassMaster. And this is going to be again, we're in 1974. This is the July-August issue. Again, this is the year of my first year actually participating. So I find it, for me, even going back in time, I've got a pretty good fishing memory. But still, I'm surprised at some of the stuff that I end up seeing that I forgot about, or that it has actually changed from how it was stated before. Again, in this magazine, again, I was starting to, due to my mentorship with Elroy Kruger, really starting to learn how to fish, being versatile with a spinnerbait. And there was two things that Elroy always did that I religiously do now with a spinnerbait. And that was putting a trailer, some type of trailer. What do you mean by that? Not a trailer hook. I do that too. But putting a trailer underneath the skirt on the spinnerbait, like you see here on these spinnerbaits. And everybody used different ones. The early trailers for most people was pork rind. The problem was with pork rind was that when you laid it down on the deck for any length of time, it'd get dry and get hard. So I actually used some form of plastic trailer. Back then, it usually, early on, it was a split tail, soft plastic split tail, what they call a split tail eel. It mimicked the pork rind eel. I used that. But probably what became my all-time favorite trailer was John Hendricks, back then it on Lucky Strike, made a ringworm. And so that became probably, even to this day, the bait I will have on the back of my spinnerbait. When I won that last tournament in 2019, that final day where I had a little under 35 pounds on the spinnerbait, I had a ringworm trailer on the back of it. Also, if I'm fishing largemouth and it's tournament day, I will have a trailer hook on the back of it. That trailer hook will give you in a day's fishing 2 or 3 fish you might not have caught otherwise, especially if they're getting close to getting on and off the beds. They get real finicky about biting. But so now largemouth, I will always run a trailer, soft plastic trailer and a trailer hook. Smallmouth, not necessarily, because smallmouths, again, their sensory ability sight-wise is usually so much better than a largemouth. So they can take off a tick on the back of that hook if they want to. And so I try, if you use a trailer worm on it, that's all they'll hit. They're so good at it, and you'll never hook one. So smallmouth, I don't use a trailer on the back of it. And this is kind of an interesting one because it's one of my very best friends who's not with us any longer, Jerry McInnes. Yeah, back then, see, he's kind of on just small sample size too. Big bass guarantee, okay? And if Jerry was sitting here beside me now, he'd be laughing at himself because there is no guarantee in anything. I mean, it depends on defined big bass. And he's talking about pretty much 10-pounders here in Florida. Also interesting to me was, this is 1974, and here is a papergraph recorder. It's so far ahead of its time. I mean, its ability to look down is the equivalent of anything we have nowadays that can only look down.
Did it print it?
They printed it on paper. Now, I wasn't really familiar with Vexilar. I actually got, Lowrance papergraph recorder like my brother Randy Fight, and they were amazing, amazing. And you not only, the thing that was kind of still probably superior about these and what you have now currently, even though I know guys this would save what you looked at all day and you could look at it at night. You could roll that paper out and look at what you looked at. And you could even mark on it, okay, this was all on the big ridge out in Penny Creek or something. So, but now I know some guys nowadays, even with these, they can transfer it to their phone and save a lot of the information they're looking at right now and on their phone and look at it later at night. So I'm certainly no expert. And looky here, do you think we can ever get away? And this was Daiwa from Japan. And so even in color, and that's the whole theory behind it. Sometimes two pieces are better than one. I'm not going to expand on that, but. And this is one I found kind of neat. And if you got this magazine, again, it's not exactly correct, but it surprised me what they talk about topwater in hot weather. Because with the Rico baits that I have fished now religiously since the U.S. Opens and stuff, in the hot weather, that's what this is about, how good topwater are in hot weather. Because my dad and everybody else said, you know, it's only good early in the morning, late in the afternoon, low light conditions. This really is a great article as far as about why it works in topwater. And I had to underline a lot of things because he even did when he went to the chugger, which is my favorite with the Rico chugger and the Rico, he goes into the sounds. Pop, the chug, and then he has a neat term which when I use this risk action when I'm using the Rico, and he says the only way you can do this risk action to make this thing skitter, and that's what I kind of do. And he has a name for it called the Georgia cackle. Where that came from, I have no idea, but that's what he calls it. And this is before I was even fishing one. And he says, the only way you can do the correct action with this thing is if you can rub your belly and pat your head at the same time. Then you can do this one. And he's kind of right. At first, it takes me a little while to get that motion. And he describes the rod motion and the reel motion, because there's two definitely connections with that. And I was intrigued by this, how that, because I didn't know where that, because I learned it from one of my guide customers. And I didn't know where he got it from, but I bet he read this article. You know, so it's kind of fascinating. And he goes through all the different types of the Pico pops, the chuggers, the you know, and then he goes through other types of topwaters. And Lucky 13 makes a smooth, and he describes what they do, what they look like on top of the water. So it's a very long article, but it'd be, if you have it, it'd be well worth you know, reading. Again, just quickly show you, here's another lake. It was Guerrero in the earlier Back in Time magazines. It was an exotic lake. Lake Dominguez in Mexico was another one where they just promoted it, and you know, where you could stay. And I mean, it was an exotic trip in bass fishing. This one again, I've kept referring to who became the first angler who stood all day, and it was this gentleman here, Ricky Green from Arkadelphia, Arkansas. It's the only one I remember that stood all day. And Jimmy Houston followed after that, and I don't know, maybe Jimmy didn't. I'm not totally, this is who I saw do it first, so I'm not going to say absolutely if that's correct. But, Ricky was dominating the BASS this year. And so he was getting, that's why he was getting a lot of coverage. He was one of those that was making a lot of casts, you know, in a day. And kind of, so I guess in some ways I'm a product of A, standing like he did, B, making as many casts as I could in a day. All right, get on back here. There's another one that really fascinated me that I want to talk about. Again, this is where we're transitioning. This was the next two tournaments that I fished this in 1974. The The next one I fished was at Beaver Lake, Arkansas. And two of my all-time favorite fishermen, one, Tommy Martin. I always had so much respect for him. And then Al Linder. Both of them actually guided on Redbird early in their careers. And of course, Al Linder became the, in fisherman guy, and his work was exceptional because he really tried to make sure it was being towed the right way, and and again, this is part of that transition that goes on now for several decades of theory versus reality. These guys gave you reality. They didn't dangle on theory a whole lot. But it was kind of a neat deal to see these two. Tommy Martin won the tournament at Beaver, and Ricky Green, who was dominating that year, was second. And here's that kid, Rick Clunn, shows up again in 26th. And then there's Jerry McInnes again. So, but anyway, what I want to kind of talk about on this tournament too, I told you earlier in the earlier Back in Time magazine, be aware of the name Billy Westmoreland and how it was connected to Johnny Morris. In this tournament, I think it was the second day of the event. On the way back in, the way in, it was brutally rough. And I had the best running boat back in. It was the Falcon Tiger. It was in rough water. I am not going to pull in. These were still those transitioning from the flat hulls to a few, modified V hulls, but most of them were still kind of flat. And I went by these boats that were sunk, and I circled them and circled them. I didn't see anybody around them, so I went in the way in. And later I found out that Johnny Morris was one of the boats that had sunk. And then it was very cold. It was the Ozarks in March or April. I'm not sure when this was, but it was early and it was cold. And where I was staying, I even went back to weigh in. I could see boats out there circling these other boats. Every boat that come by was circling. But anyway, Johnny Morris, he had a life jacket on, but the waves were so bad he was getting thrashed around. And he grabbed one of the floating tanks, and when Billy had come by him, Billy's the one that picked him up. And Johnny was actually trying to scratch a note to his family on that gas tank, goodbye, because he thought he was going to drown. And Billy Westmoreland picked him up and took him and his partner in. And so I became aware of that through eventually the tournament. They didn't say a thing about it in this article, which Ray was real protective about not showing that, what he called, negative publicity stuff. But it's entered my mind so many times. And it's not just Johnny Morris, but what would we been denied if that person hadn't been part of this industry? And he wouldn't have been. He was convinced of it later. And here's ending on a little humorous part. Johnny had heard that and this is like 4 or 5 years ago now, so this is in the 2000s. He said, "I heard you saw where my boat went down at." And I said, "Yeah, Johnny, I did. I went by it." And he says, "Was it out in front of Ford Creek?" And I said, "Yeah, it was." I said, "Why you want to know?" He says, "Because I want to find it." That's typical Johnny. I imagine he had submarines and divers of all kinds. They never did find it. That boat never came. And so that gets back to the full flotation here in this one. Those boats didn't have full flotation. And so it went to the bottom in Beaver, which is a pretty deep lake. And, but it was kind of it's just a lot of lessons in that story. I mean, about how fragile life is, and how one person's absence in it can totally change things in a good way, but sometimes in a bad way. So,
in your Arkansas Invitational, do you remember how you were catching them?
Yeah, I did.
What was your weight?
My weight was, I made a small check back then. It was probably a couple $100, and that wasn't going to get me a home. I remember that vividly. I didn't catch a limit any day. I had 25 pounds, 3 ounces for 3 days. So it was kind of a tough tournament, but I did on a Balsa B square bill, Balsa B3 square bill. I did catch the second biggest bass of the tournament. The biggest bass of the tournament was a boat, but the second biggest bass was $750. And y'all have heard the story about that check. That's the one I tried to cash in Sears Roebuck in Memphis, Tennessee. So I was on the way back from that tournament. So it was a good tournament for me because I did make a small check placing, and I did catch the second biggest bass. And then they were all on burning a Balsa B out through a 25-foot top of a cedar tree.
The next one, the Tennessee Invitational, how'd you do in that one?
Last place.
Oh.
But I did get a small check.
Fantastic.
That's the last money place.
Okay.
These tournaments had close to 200 anglers in them.
So what was your weight and what place?
It was 18 pounds 9 ounces, and they don't say how many fish you had. Al Linder won it, and he's the only one that caught a limit every day. It was a 10-fish limit. He had 30 fish that weighed 42 pounds. So, and he's the only one that did have a limit every day. And this is the first time I noticed so far Jimmy Houston's name showing up. In trivia, what Jimmy Houston, like I give Ricky Green credit for standing all day, Jimmy Houston was the first underhand cast guy that I'm aware of that could actually do that little flip underhand cast. And it looks like it was shooting out the end of a gun, the way he was so good at it, him and his wife, Chris.
Do you remember what you were fishing with? And where?
I was actually fishing with a chugger, but it wasn't a Rico. Back then, Rico didn't exist. And I was fishing shade pockets along the coves, in the coves, underneath in the middle of the day where we'd have a small shade pocket. Big shade pockets, we still do that a lot, and everybody does nowadays. They fish the shade, especially out west. But the smaller the pocket, the more likely, you could catch fish. Big shade pocket, you might not throw near him, and you might not be, aggressively attacking it. But I didn't catch very many fish. And I remember it was probably my first really, really tough event. So, and like I said, Al won it. And so that was back in time, again, 1974, July and August. Thank you.